Usually when I speak about history, we start off from 652. So that was the settlement of Europe right here. But the human presence in this part of South Africa dates back to more than 27,000 years ago.
I find it inconceivable that the Dutch sailed past the lovely Cape and said, oh, there's a lovely vacant piece of land, let's go and set up there.
I don't think we pay enough homage to the fact that slaves contributed significantly, not to the building of the castle only, but the building of the Cape economy, of the South African economy, and we don't do enough. It's very important that we do commend what government has put in, 108 million rand to deal with the physical makeover and to make it a better castle.
It's not done for its own sake, just because the Defence Force wants to be nice, but it's done in order to create an environment in which people can not only begin to find themselves, but also to seek to understand each other.
A call for all cultures to unite. Young and old gathered for a feast of entertainment programs, from Zulu, Xhosa and champion Khoi reel dancers to a Cape and Lay choir and the minstrels. And everyone is welcome. Government hopes to have it recognized as a World Heritage Site.
The plans that we have started now is to get really our professors, a team of professors, together working with the Castle Control Board and the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, and make sure that we make the castle as it must look like Robben Island as a World Heritage Site.
Using local expertise, the project will create employment for 200 people. Another highlight was the SA National Defence Force Band, and to the delight of the crowd, the much-anticipated firing of the ceremonial cannon not only took place at 12, as is tradition, but marked every hour. Carmen Lochenberg, SABC News, Cape Town.
Obviously, the Dutch were not the first people to arrive on the southwestern coast of South Africa. There were the Portuguese before them, the Spaniards before them. But I think why the focus is on the Dutch, when they landed here in 1652, and even before that, they meant business.
The Europeans were not willing to learn the means and the mechanisms of communication and ways of living of the indigenous people.
A lot of the information has been lost and it's not really residing within Cape Town anymore, like the old name of Cape Town. So that's where I heard of the pipe, meaning covered in clouds.
I think the arrival of the Dutch in South Africa at the southernmost tip of Africa, to me, points to the first point of land dispossession at the tip of Africa.
This place, called Pipe, is a beautiful place, and it's always been like that. You can imagine like this backdrop of Table Mountain, very green, beautiful, lush green, filled with food, different types of medicines. It's a bit of a utopia right here. So for the Khoi people living here, they thrived here. This was an amazing place for them. Some of the oral history also says this is where spirituality among Khoi and Bushman people occurred. This is where the birthing of spirituality. And even the name Hurikwaga, mountain rising out of the sea, takes us even way back because they had the knowledge of the space even before it is as it is now. when it was once covered in the ocean.
They really eyed the southernmost part of Africa for a variety of reasons, but the major one is the long journey to get from Rotterdam or where they ever come from to the east, to the spices of the east. So they were worried about all the diseases on the ships and all of the mutinies on the ships. So they needed a halfway station in between Europe and the east.
However, the reality of what happened then is that South Africa was not an unoccupied space. It had people, and therefore there had to be negotiations in terms of acquiring the needed space for them.
The governors of the Dutch Empire, so to speak, were only deployed for short periods. So they deployed for 10-year periods. So the first 10-year period was Van Riebeeck's. And he built a fort, a wood, clay, and stone fort, not too far from here, just opposite on the parade side of the castle. I think he misjudged the weather of the Cape. After the first couple of months or the first winter, they realized that this wooden and clay and brick structure will not last forever. So during his middle way of his tenure, they've decided to look for a better spot and for a more permanent kind of structure. And that happened, the first clearing of this ground at the castle happened on the 25th of September in 1665.
For the Dutch to set up in Cape Town, something had to be removed. It's common sense that something had to be dispossessed.
One of the settlements was the settlement of Gogosua, one of the local captains of the Khoi indigenous people here, had to be removed in order for the castle to be built eventually, as I say, on the 2nd of January 1665. So I think in a way, that's the first recorded displacement of people from the land of birth.
They were living their authentic lives. They were living in the best manner in which they knew how. They were living in a practiced manner, and that was fine, that was good. It served them well. When the Dutch came and when the castle was built, that had to change because they now had to accommodate this castle being built on their space.
Given the tendencies of those years, the 1500s and the 1400s, the negotiation was less about seeking to convince and negotiate with people for things. There had always been a military aspect. In other words, the tendency to take things by force.
I think most of the captains, most of the kings of the indigenous people were okay with trading. You give us iron, you give us beads, you give us tobacco, you give us arak, which was the cheap wine, you give us whatever you give us, and we'll give you cattle for that. We'll give you sheep or we'll give you cows for that.
On the part of the giver, it might have been simply an act in which you borrow somebody something that they don't have, and with the expectation that when time comes, you will go back and get your things. Whereas the European understanding was more, if you give me, it becomes mine forever and permanently.
When you say, what did the Dutch come and do here? They dispossessed the first inhabitants of this country, of their land. And I think to this day, we are still feeling the effects of that land dispossession and that colonization.
The people were not necessarily willing participants in that. Yes, in the first instance, they welcomed them and entered into some basic relationships. But as the Dutch needs grew, they then began to seek to use coercive means, which invariably led to clashes between the indigenous communities that were here.
When you bring two worldviews into one space, there will be misunderstandings. There were clear indications from the recorded history, which is not the recorded history from a pre-colonial perspective, from an indigenous people perspective. But even in the colonial narrative, there are very clear signs that there were large elements in the indigenous population that was very clear in their minds that this was an invasion. This was an intrusion in their motherland, in their economic and cultural systems. Because that's why there were Khoisan resistant movements. There were wars against the Dutch.
And as a result of these persistent clashes between them, a decision, I think, was then made to build a fort, let's call it, which transformed to becoming the castle as we have it today.
The design philosophy behind the castle, like all fortification, is a military. It's a military design. The way that the castle is also designed, it's not like the fort, four points. It's got 5 points. So it's almost in a formation that you can, when the enemy is coming, there's no point where you will miss the enemy.
Yeah, like this 5-pointed star, pentagram, took a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of pain, blood, sweat, tears, everything.
So the colonial viewpoint would be that the earlier colonialists would have built the castle, which cannot be true.
It is undeniable that slavery and oppression were part and parcel of the Castle of Good Hope.
The whole castle is built with rocks. It's not bricks made somewhere, which then means these people had to go and hew the rocks from the surrounding mountains, bring them here and work here.
If you look at the heavy beams, surely a handful of early colonialists could never have done that alone. It's always portrayed that the Dutch colonialists built this castle, or they say Van Kasteel or Van Riebeeck built the fort, but they needed hands, and the hands from Europe were not enough. So where do they get the hands?
In order to build the castle now, practically, they then needed extra labor. And that necessitated bringing in not Europeans from Holland, but bringing in slaves, firstly from Angola, and then secondly, because the Dutch East India Company had already moved into Indonesia.
If you look at the official Dutch approach to indigenous people, was not to enslave them and not to treat them badly, whatever the word badly meant. Because if you look at what really happened on the ground, then treating poorly in their eyes and in the indigenous people were two different things. Let's accept that they didn't want to enslave the indigenous people. It was a policy. But by the time they got here, they were already enslaving people of the East. They already had a couple of centuries of slavery. Those kind of relationships were transported into the castle setup.
The castle is not only this wonderful, grand building. The castle hides so many painful stories. The castle hides so many vicious stories.
I even heard that you can even find skeletons within the walls, because as they were built, a lot of them died in the process. So they didn't still want to go through a whole process of burying someone. So they were supposed to basically put skeletons. So these bones in between these walls. This is actually a very this space. I always tell all South Africans must come here, because this space has touched so many people's lives. How many people came through those doors? How many people was locked up in the cells? How many people were tortured? You know, whether with Asian descent, African descent, European descent, the whole world were tortured right here. They were forced. It was by the whip.
The torture chamber was just that. It was a torture chamber. And we find that we have very many Europeans visiting, and it is the one place that affects them very deeply. And it affects them very deeply on two completely different levels. We have some people not wanting to face it at all and saying, I don't feel I've got to come in here. And automatically there's a barrier set up. Again, it's an uncomfortable truth that one has to face. And it is far easier to be a denialist and say, oh, look at the wonderful building we have here. Look at the great craftsmanship here. Look at how wonderfully thick these walls are and how fabulously this castle was built. That is what we've become used to. That in that torture room, people were made to confess to things they never did. People were there for days and days and days. And you say, oh, well, you know what? The apartheid government used to detain people for days and days and days until they confessed to things they never did. Why are you surprised at that? That was common practice at the castle long before the apartheid government.
I was one confronted in that area, in the torture chamber, by a white woman. And she was quite angry. She said, the way that you interpret the history is very wishy-washy, it's very superficial. But you know that my great-grandmother she had a relationship with a slave at this castle. And the slave, the man, was sentenced to death. But my great-great-grandmother was sentenced to be tortured and mutilated. She was first kept in the torture chamber, and when her face was branded, she was cut. There were literally marks with a hot iron burned into her flesh so that no man would be interested in her. This woman was angry, and she was from France, I think, presumably. She spoke with an accent. And why don't you, in a sensitive manner, also portray what kind of injustices happened in this castle? And that really made me set up straight. Because I thought by putting a chain there, by hanging, by sewing this pulley, we are doing enough. We're really at that point where we want to not only talk about the good things that happen at the castle, or, we're already at that point where we want to balance the castle, but really to give us interpretation techniques to speak to this woman's pain, to also make her feel that the real true story are the people who were in and out of the torture chambers. Some of them were put behind a horse cart, horses, and pulled out of this castle and were put on either under the gallows or on a, what do we call, a pole outside of the castle for the crows and the birds of prey to eat their flesh.
So even the descendants today, when they think about the castle, a lot of people just are cut off from the castle. District 6 is not far from here. I've often asked older people, what was the reflections of the space being so close to District 6? They said, we never went there. We walked there, we're like in fear. Just hurried past. And I always wondered, but why? Because these are the people, the descendants of the people that actually built the space, right? District 6 being vibrant communities, being multi-ethnic, being all people living there. So these are the people that built it.
We're trying to say that what happened at the Kasteel de Goede Hoop has to be acknowledged, because the foundation for the social ills that we are experiencing today is what happened here. And to find solutions to what we are currently experiencing, we have to acknowledge and explore the root of it.
This castle was the first formal government of South Africa, the first High Court, Supreme Court, the first Court of Appeal, first council, the first church. all India. It has been a center, a nexus, a center of power, and all of the other influences were devolved from there. The bastion of power was amongst the 5 walls of the castle. And nothing personifies that better than the cut balcony, where all the important decisions affecting the lives of the citizens were read off in the form of placards, of the Dutch called it plakkaten, where the people were called together in the front courtyard and were informed about the major decisions about who's going to die, who's going to be married, who's going to be baptized, who's going to be land titles going to be allocated, whose land is going to be taken off, who's going to be sent out to war. All of those important decisions were taken here.
This became a garrison, in other words, a place where they could be protected, and obviously as established governments settled, then they used this as a place of protection, and therefore the number of soldiers increased within this. And in fact, the dispatching of soldiers to the hinterland, they then said to themselves, oh, okay, why don't we in actual fact expand and occupy this whole land so that it becomes part and parcel of the empire.
One of the ladies whom we will be honoring on the 19th of August, Kretua, is a very young girl who was lured into the Van Riebeeck household to not only play a kind of a servant, but also to play a translation role.
Kretua, also known as Eva, is very often referred to as the mother of a nation. Something that was important for me, and that is important for me, that stands out for me, is the issue of identity and the issue of duality.
What have you done? Oh, what have you done to me? I'm building walls all around.
She gets brought in here as a house help of the Van Riebeecks. But of course, there's always been contempt for her culture by the Van Riebeecks and their ilk. So they also then obviously engaged in a process of transformation to say to her, to do to her really than say, to do to her, what we have is better than what you had outside the castle. Then the second thing is she became a translator because she understood the Dutch language because she lived here.
Everybody, I was born loving everybody. Everybody, but now when things are moving way too fast, they need to slow down.
She had the intelligence to be a part of the Dutch society, and she also came from her indigenous tribe. And that was a space that not very many people could move between at that time. She had the ability to move between the two spaces. But that in itself led to a conflict within her. She didn't know where she fit in.
And that put her in a very bad situation with regards to her people, who then, obviously, to use today's language, regarded her as a sellout, because they were never sure if she says everything that they are saying in terms of the consequences of what actually happened. And on the other hand, of course, the Van Riebeecks, the Dutch, were never sure whether she is totally loyal to the cause of the empire. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, as part of that denuding of the self, she then gets converted to become a Christian, and her name becomes Eva. And so, according to them, the transformation is complete. She is now like one of us.
Krotoa very much gets maligned in our history books, and we speak of her, or we have spoken of her through our colonial history of a prostitute.
For me, the direct link to the castle is that she was buried here under the first church of the castle. Her bones were then dug up with bones of other people, taken to the Grote Kerk, which was the first big Dutch Reformed kerk in town. And the significance of bringing her back into the history books, people want to see her died as a broken, heart-sore, drunkard.
Is that all she was? And again, looking at society today, prostitution, alcoholism, drug abuse, what are the underlying problems?
So I think we must understand that, and in a sense, why it's important to honor her is he represents all the good, all the bad, and all the ugly of when you colonize, when you have a brutal force, a brutal colonial force impose itself on indigenous people, bringing your cultural norms, your diseases, your language, and then you say, look how they are. And I think we want to restore her place in history, like all the other mothers of our nation. For me, the significance of Krotoa mustn't be divorced from the significance of all the other people.
As the expansion took place, those who resisted in the hinterland, they were then brought here, incarcerated here.
King Adam Kok of the Griquas was also at this castle, incarcerated in the castle, played a role in this castle. King Langalebelele of the Mhlubis in KwaZulu-Natal also played a role at this castle. King Cetshwayo, relative of King Saka, and now King Goodwill Zwelithini, also played a role here.
King Cetshwayo is, of course, one of the key people in those wars of resistance. And you will recall that the apex of that was the so-called the Battle of Isandlwana, in which the British were not only humiliated, but they were defeated. But again, as the plan had always been, in order to break the resistance, the issue was then to decapitate the community, take the leadership out. But the irony about King Cetshwayo is that he, in fact, had actually requested to have a meeting with Queen Victoria, equal to equal, as far as he was concerned. And then you got the colonial masters in the Western Cape, sort of, which was the headquarters, as it were, of the colony, deceiving King Cetshwayo that he is in fact going to be taken to the Queen. So he voluntarily comes out of KwaZulu-Natal, boards a ship, and is brought to Cape Town and is kept in the castle. And obviously, he keeps on asking, when is he going to be taken to the Queen? And they just kept on, I guess, saying all kinds of things in order to prevent him. Whilst at the same time breaking down the resistance that was there in KwaZulu-Natal.
There's also Adam Tas, the first the farmer, who was opposing colonial rule. There's King Sekukuni or Chief Sekukuni from Limpopo. So the point that I want to make, the castle belongs to all. If you look at the recent history of the castle, the period 60 years before the release of Mandela, this used to be the army headquarters. So in a sense, even if there wasn't a prison here, the deployment of the apartheid army into Langa, Guguleto, Nyanga, Missile Plate, Trojan Horse incident, all of it were either planned or physically executed from here. That's also part of the history that's not told at the castle at this moment. The castle need to take full responsibility, not the building, the people who sat in these offices, the institutions, whether they were generals, colonels, whatever, who formulated those instructions and who executed those instructions needs to come clean and tell the story. I think 20, 22, 25 years, even 30 years is enough space between the painful things that happen and the people who endured those pain to tell their stories at the castle. There's no excuses to cut out and paste somewhere some of those uncomfortable stories.
We can't celebrate people being put in slave, we can't celebrate torturing people, killing people. We can't celebrate, but we can remind ourselves and remember that it's our blood, it's our families, it's our great-great-grandfather, great-mother that went through this.
As a center of punishment, as a center of meting out justice, the role of the castle is very important and should not be underestimated. A lot of, we will call it the center of justice. Many of us will today say it's injustice because if we extract a confession from a prisoner or of a detainee, how can it be justice? But in terms of Dutch Roman law, that was perfectly justice in their eyes. So I think in this commemoration, we also want to point out the injustices in the name of justice that we meted out in the walls of the castle and how we could honor those people who have been detained here, where in the history book they were only made out as prisoners or as detainees.
Before you get to that grand scheme, there are these building blocks that are necessary. And the only way they can happen is if we open the gates of the castle. And by opening the gates of the castle, it's saying, what is it that we want people to see? Now, if we simply leave it as it is, it then means we ourselves today are perpetuating the narratives that were not written by us, that I might add, we don't understand and we were never part of. And those narratives were instituted exactly to suppress and undermine and divide us. And I don't think it would be proper in a new South Africa to continue those narratives.
The castle has recently positioned itself as a space which can be used for community upliftment and development. And it is those currently disenfranchised communities who are now using the space to uplift and empower themselves.
Ek is 'n produk van die gemeenskap van die Kaap. Maar my story is bietjie anders. Is net dieselfde is not any different than other people's story. The story is exactly the same story. It's our story. As the surviving name of Table Mountain suggests, Urikwago or Urikwaga. Okay, so we hype. Let's give it a try. Don't be shy. I usually tell people your tongues won't fall out of your mouth. Okay, and this is the original language of this part of the world. And I'm from the Cape Flats, I know this. A lot of people think that they don't have culture. I was doing a class and this one girl, 12-year-old, said, "But sir, our people in the Cape Flats, our Kara people, we don't have a culture. What are you talking about culture today to us?" And that struck me so hard, so innocent, that child. So the topic became that day, do we have culture? All humans have culture, whether they're aware of it or not. We hype. Give a hand, give a hand. Daar's baie woorde ook wat we sê, asseblief tog. Die tog is actually van 'n woord noem togoba, wat asseblief beteken. Nou sê ons eintlik asseblief, please, we're accentuating that we need it, please. So ons sê ook gee ma daai ding. But in the Khoi language, ma means to give. Daai bra ou vir my 'n vibe op. Daai woord ou beteken is ook 'n Khoi woord. Sien, is mean ek also to give. Ou vir my gou 'n 50 sent. So there's baie woorde wat ons ons sê is 'n kiri, 'n karos, 'n bietjie boegu, kukamakranka, goga. Wat net gooi ons anders maar ek wil sê goga is nog 'n Khoi woord wat vir 27,000 jaar in die Kaap al gebruik word. So goga beteken dieselfde ding in die Khoi taal as wat beteken in Afrikaans.
To what extent did the castle and its ethos spread into the country in order to entrench them? In other words, how did the European invasion into South Africa manifest itself in a way that it sought to reproduce itself in us?
So that idea of things not actually coming on a ship, it wasn't imported. It has been here forever, for a long time. So that is the idea of this work that we bring in here, this indigenous knowledge, because this is basically what we're speaking about. This knowledge that is peculiar and specific to this area, whether it's reflected in language, in the medicines that is endemic to this region, being one of the plant kingdoms of the world. I mean, 10% of all the plant species in the world is right here, and this is the smallest plant kingdom in the world also, this Cape Floral Kingdom. We are actually living in paradise, but we don't know this. We're living on a World Heritage Site on the foot of a Table Mountain, and there's also Robben Island. This doesn't happen like this, by the way.
That's where the castle comes in, so that the castle is not only then a place of safety for soldiers, but it is also a place of finding each other within its walls, so that we begin to understand what is really true of us as a people, as a nation.
The spiritual reclaiming of the castle, or I would say the non-tangible, dealing with the difficult history, using it as a symbol of inclusion and healing, fortunately coincided with the physical makeover. I would almost say the cosmetic makeover. If we kept this castle in the dilapidated state, we would have found it very difficult to sell the message of renewal, of inclusivity, of nation building, of education. In a sense, the physical renewal is reinforcing the spiritual renewal of the castle. It's not simply cosmetic, it's deeper. For the first time, people will have access through lifts to the castle, through better ramping, through better signage, through rooms that were standing dormant and closed with old chairs. For the first time, it's in a sense an opening up. Not only physically, but also an opening up of the heart.
And therefore to increase also then the access to learning, both military, social and personal, for our school children.
Through projects that have been put in place by the Kasteel of Goede Hoop, projects like skills development programs, women empowerment programs, entrepreneurship programs, youth development programs.
In order to go forward, we need to reconnect with our past, with our roots, the Roman. So this program we have with Abate, we're connecting our people with social history, not necessarily his story, but our story also, our language, our medicines, and also our music. This is saying underneath all of our skins, we're all Bushmen. Okay. Because the first people were the Bushmen. And there was a time when there were only people living on Africa. So welcome back home, because this is your home. This is the home of all humans, the cradle of humankind.
Through these projects, which encourage empowerment, development, transformation, and dialogue, we are not only bringing the people to the castle, but we are taking the castle and its new vision and mission to the people. More importantly though, we are making ordinary South African citizens know that this is a space which is a part of them and of which they are a part.
So that kids should come from Limpopo to understand some of the things that are actually going on there now, that they can begin to understand themselves.
And stories in themselves don't mean anything, but when the stories can be translated into the effect that they have on people, not only then, but even in today's society, that's when they have to be explored, and that's what we're currently trying to do here.
To quote President Mandela, when he said, "Never again shall this nation treat other people in ways that makes anybody feel inferior," it's something that we should actually take seriously and ask the question, what is never again? What are some of those things that actually happened and were inflicted on other people that we should never again produce for this nation, so that we can begin to have a society of equals, a society of mutual respect, a society of dignity for all people.
This memory of pain is there, but we're trying to push this memory as far distant back, so let's forget about the pain. So this unmasking it's a process, 360 odd years to undo the pain of that intergenerational pain and that whole thing. It's going to take a lot of time.
And that, to me, is one of the challenges that is presented to us today about the castle.
Yeah, this is what we want people to connect with themselves, really, and to reconnect of who they are. History will hold you accountable.
And by calling somebody a Bushman or whatnot or whatever is not helpful for the national agenda of reconciliation.
This is the words that's on the coat of arms of South Africa. Diverse people unite. But that is very powerful, because if you think about it, the Khoi and the San languages has influenced all other languages in the country. Towards the language got the clicks from them. There's a lot of Nguni languages got many words. Also, the Afrikaans, so many words come from it. Hoga, Aina, Abba, Kiri, Karos, Buhu. There's so many words actually. Even Ha, Yini in Zulu, and causes Nkomo, Buti, Sisi. There's so many examples, residues, linguistic residues. So we all owe a linguistic debt to the Khoi and San language families.
Certainly Nama and some of the remnants of those old languages, there are ways without putting too much even resources in there to still give recognition to those languages and let itself play out. And if people want to identify, give people that identity, of course subject to the national identity. And I think Everybody must understand that we have a role to play in that.
We need our languages recognized. It's very important because identity is connected to language, culture is connected to language.
What we're trying to do with this almost rewriting of our history, of the unearthing of the hidden stories, is also to bring those collective strands together, to try to reunite what colonialism and apartheid divided. We try to do that. But it's very fine nuances and it's complex. And I think we need to respect it, and we respect the difficult work that all of us have as cultural activists to bring an understanding amongst those communities.
In other words, how did the European invasion into South Africa